All right, let's do our Al Sfirat HaOmer blessing together. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu Al Sfirat HaOmer. Yesterday was the 46th day of the Omer, so you can guess what today is going to be. You can repeat the formula after me. Hayom Shivta ve'arba'im Yom Shehem Shisa Shavuot V'chamisha Yamim La'omer. Today is the 47th day, which makes 6 weeks and 5 days to the Omer. All right, let's say our Sok B'divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu Sok B'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, rule of the universe, who's made us holy with the commandments, and command us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So, the question for tonight is, when is Shavuot? Which you would think would be a fairly simple question to answer. But as it turns out, it is not, because the Torah doesn't give us a date for Shavuot. Yet we have a date. So the question is, how did we end up with a date? So we start our exploration with a more basic question of when is Passover? And for that, we look at the Torah. And it tells us in Numbers, on the first month, on the 14th day of the month, there shall be a Passover sacrifice to God. All right, so biblically, the first month is Nisan. So that tells us we're in the month of Nisan on the 14th day of the month. Okay, fine. Maybe we'll skip the questions for now. When is Sukkot? Again, we look at the Torah. On the 15th day of the 7th month, there shall be the Feast of Booths to Adonai. So the 7th month biblically is Tishrei. So according to this text, when is Sukkot? What does the text say?
15th Tishrei.
15th of Tishrei. All right.
Full moon.
Good. Yes, it's a full moon. All right. The questions here are not designed to be, are more like questions that are surface level. You can find it sitting on the surface of the text mostly. These are not questions to where there's multiple right answers. All right, so let's try to figure out Shavuot's date. What does Genesis tell us about Shavuot's date? Gornished. Nothing. Genesis doesn't discuss the Jewish holidays at all, with the possible exception of Shabbat, when it says that God made the 7th day whole. Fine. What does Exodus tell us about Shavuot's date? So, in Exodus, it says that 3 times a year you shall hold a festival for me. You've got Passover, and then the Feast of the Harvest of the first fruits of your work of what you sow in the field. So what does this tell us about when Shavuot is? The text that's bolded in front of you.
First fruits of your work and what you saw in the field.
It's going to be a function of agriculture.
Yeah.
This is at the end of the year.
Whenever you plant your seeds.
No, first fruits, not harvest.
Well, it's both. It's the Feast of the Harvest, comma, the first fruits of your work.
So the harvest.
In Hebrew, Chag HaKatzir, Bikurei Ma'asecha. All right, and what does it call Shavuot, by the way?
Feast of Ingathering.
You just said it. Chag HaKatzir is one of them.
Yeah, Feast of the Harvest. Good. Okay. Also in Exodus, we shall observe the Feast of Weeks of the first fruits of the wheat harvest. So what does that tell us about when Shavuot is?
Wheat.
Yeah,
Harvest.
something about the wheat harvest.
Yeah.
And what is it called, Shavuot?
Feast of
Weeks.
Weeks.
Service of the wheat harvest.
Feast
It
of the Weeks.
says, doesn't it say Chag Shavuot right there, first two words?
Yeah,
And what
Feast of
you-
Weeks, which is in Hebrew Chag Shavuot. So if you see weeks, it means Shavuot.
Shavuot.
All right, good. Let's go on to Leviticus. So, this one's slightly more complicated. From the day on which you bring the sheaf of elevation offering, which is the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. And you count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days, and then you bring an offering of new grain to God, which this is the origin for counting the Omer, which is what we've been doing the last 7 weeks.
Mhm.
All right, then tells you what to do with this. It's a bunch of sacrificey stuff, along with the bread of the first fruits. And on the same day, you shall hold a celebration, sacred occasion for you, don't work at your occupation, and so on. Okay, so when is Shavuot? Based off of this.
When you first bring in some of the wheat from the harvest, you cut off 7 weeks.
I think it's actually going to be barley, not wheat, because barley ripens earlier than wheat in
Yes.
Israel.
Okay.
Your
All
straw
right.
David, David,
Yeah.
wasn't one of this the big differences with the Karaites, because the Karaites thought that the Sabbath really meant the Sabbath and not Pesach?
Sadducees, but yes, we'll get
Oh.
there.
Close, different sect.
Yes. So according to the text of the Torah, you count 7 weeks starting from the day after the Sabbath.
completely.
And then you count 50 days, and then you bring an offering of new grain to God, which is going to be Shavuot. Good. All right, and there does not appear to be a name for the holiday here. All right, so this raises a question of when does one bring a sheaf of elevation offering? Because you start counting after that 7 weeks, as we just saw. So
This is confusing.
this is confusing. I don't disagree with you. If it were simple, we could have finished the class in 5 minutes.
Yeah. On one foot, right?
Exactly.
Preferably
So
This is great.
starting with Passover, when you enter the land and you reap its harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. And at that point, the priest will elevate the sheaf of elevation on the day after the Sabbath. So this has something to do with Passover and a harvest and the day after the Sabbath. If you're confused about this, you're not alone. The rabbis spent 3 full pages of the Talmud trying to puzzle this one out. And we're spending a whole class period on it. So it's fine. If you're still confused by the end, ask again, and I'll try to make it clearer in the follow-up email. All right,
There's
let's move on.
also-
Yes.
Sorry.
Go
There's also in the text we just looked at really quickly. There is no mention of similar language for other holidays talking about a prohibition on work. Is that
Oh, sure.
somewhat relevant to this? I don't know.
Yes.
It talks about a prohibition on work for each of the holidays in different places throughout the Torah. I haven't brought all of them, but we have seen it for Shavuot, and it talks about it for Passover and Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So those 5 get a and Shabbat. So those 6 get a prohibition on work.
Oh, okay, but it is directly mentioned in the text of the Torah for Shavuot.
Convocation is it?
Yes, it is directly mentioned. I think it was buried in the Exodus stuff, and we might see it yet again.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yep, no worries. Good question. All right, let's move on to the hopefully less confusing book of Numbers. So this is the Maftir, the Torah reading, the extra Torah reading that we read on Shavuot, describing the sacrifice for Shavuot. So it says, on the day of the first fruits, your feast of weeks, when you bring a new grain, offering of new grain to God, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. And then you shall present the sacrifices, which are basically sacred barbecue. All right, so what does this text tell us about when Shavuot is? If anything.
Well, isn't it a little confusing? Because they're saying you're not supposed to work, but you have to bring in the sheaves. So how can you do that?
This text tells us we should bring in the sheaves.
Well, you should observe the new grain. You shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations.
Right, so we don't work. But where does it say about bringing in the sheaves?
Well,
I think you're
That's
referring
what-
to
isn't
an
that what the-
offering of new grain, but that's not the same as schlepping sheaves in from the field. That's shaking some of the grain from those sheaves into a basket and bringing that in, which apparently they were
When
allowed
it
to carry.
says on the day of the first fruits, is that the day the first fruits appear, the first
Feast of
grains?
Weeks. I think it's
Here?
bread, basically. It's already baked in bread and brought on Shavuot itself.
These are questions. You all are thinking like good Mishnaic rabbis, trying to puzzle out what exactly does the Torah mean when it says this stuff?
right. Well, one thing I've been reading a book about. It's called the 6,000 Years of Bread.
Yeah,
And it turns out the Egyptians were the first ones to make bread. I mean, to
I'm looking
grow.
at my stomach.
So I'm assuming that we learned how to make bread and grow wheat from the Egyptians.
seems likely.
And that's then you have the Passover because we couldn't wait long enough to make the bread, so we ended up having crackers, instead. Anyway, that's an aside, and I'm sorry.
That's all
Is
right.
the day of the first fruits, the day the first fruits appear, or the day we bring those in on Shavuot to the temple?
I believe it's the day that you bring them.
It specifies
right
your
in
first
any
feast,
time.
your Feast of Weeks.
That would
Doesn't,
make sense since it says when you bring an offering. So that would presume that you already have
It's
the
Shavuot.
ability to bring the offering, which would mean it would have already had to been harvested, right?
Correct.
well, in order to know, if we go by what we've been told before, it's 7 weeks. The day after Sabbath is Shavuot. So we're given a time period, are we not?
Yes.
But when does it start?
All right. Let's keep going. And we note that again, this is called the day of the first fruits, and quote, your feast of weeks, which in Hebrew would be Chag Shavuot. All right, let's move on to Deuteronomy. This is the Torah reading for the second day of Deuteronomy, or part of the second day of Shavuot, and the end for Shmini Atzeret and the end of Passover as well. All right, after eating unleavened bread for 6 days, you hold a solemn gathering for God on the 7th day. This is still Passover, do no work. Count off 7 weeks. Start to count the 7 weeks from when the sickle is first put to the standing grain. Then, after you've counted off 7 weeks, you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, Chag Shavuot, offering your free will contribution according to as your God has blessed you. And you should do some rejoicing where God tells you to. Keep in mind that you were slaves. All right.
So this must start the day after the 7th day. because
No.
you have to put the sickle to the wheat, and therefore you can't do it on the seventh day. You have to do it on the eighth day.
Gotta agree. I gotta disagree here.
Oh, the seventh day is a day of rest.
Yes, it is. But I don't think I don't think they mean the seventh day. It's after it's going to be somewhere after the first rest day, which will be the first day of Pesach. And then look at your Haggadah. When do you start counting on it? The second night, because we're in Galut, right?
I think that
That's not what that's not what the text is saying. We're not talking about the
Mhm.
Haggadah. We're talking about the Bible at the moment, the Torah.
Agreed, but that means we have to find it here in Torah.
I think so. So looking at the text itself, the pshat, the simple understanding, literal understanding of the text, based off of what goes first and then what is said, seems to imply first you eat unleavened bread 6 days, then you have your seventh day, then you count off 7 weeks, because it goes boom, 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 boom in the text. And regardless of when you start counting, you start to count from when the sickle is first put to the standing grain. That is right there in black and white. So this seems to suggest that if I put my sickle to the grain on Tuesday, I count off 7 weeks from Tuesday. And if you put the sickle to the grain on Thursday, then you start counting 7 weeks from Thursday. And then you observe the Feast of Weeks.
So everybody has a
Do we
different
both
one.
take Monday as a day of rest?
So this
Or do we
still,
take
so this
different days of
has,
rest?
right. So we've got 2 issues. One is where does this fall relative to Passover? And 2, does this mean that everybody has a different understanding of when Shavuot is?
David, yeah,
Yes.
we're saying that we cut the wheat with a sickle, and then
Yes.
7 weeks later, then the day after Sabbath, then we observe Shavuos. Do I have that right?
So you do, and part of what this seems to suggest is that within the Torah itself, there are different ideas of when Shavuot is, as we will see momentarily with a recap of what we know. And so this may suggest different authors for Shavuot, or if you think that God gave all of it, God giving different ideas that seem to be contradictory, but clearly must not be because God is perfect. Depends how you feel about the authorship of the Torah. So here's what we have as a recap. Exodus. Shavuot is sometime after a harvest, specifically the wheat harvest. Leviticus. Shavuot is 50 days after the sheaf of elevation offering. This happens the day after the Sabbath. It appears to be connected to the Sabbath somewhere around Passover. Numbers. Shavuot is sometime when you have the first fruits. And Deuteronomy, Shavuot is 7 weeks after the sickle is first put to the standing grain. That's what the Torah tells us about Shavuot.
But didn't we have a discussion last week about somebody said Shavuot was celebrated one day in one place and a
Yes.
day in another place. So that's what this sounds like.
Right. So
Can I-
that's about the fact that that Shavuot is a one-day holiday in the Torah and in Israel, and it's a 2-day holiday outside of Israel.
Right.
Because there was a concern that when the new month was announced and the messages were spread out to beyond the land of Israel, that they might not have gotten there in time. And so you weren't sure exactly when the new month started, which means that therefore you weren't sure when like the 15th of the month was or the 6th of the month or whatever. So you do an extra day just to like increase the chances that you probably got it right one of those days. And then after we standardized the calendar, we were used to doing it that way, so we kept doing it anyway, even though we knew exactly when it was. Because tradition.
David,
Yes.
I found this on the internet. It's from the Jerusalem Post.
Okay,
and it might help a little bit. It says the process begins around the month of Kislev, November, December, when staggered sowing of the seeds over a period of 4 months. The first crops harvested are flax and barley around the time of the month of Nisan,
uh-huh,
coinciding with the festival of Passover. It is not coincidental that the barley omer offering today, commemorated by counting the over, took place on Passover, the month of Sivan in May. It is a time of the wheat harvest and is reflected in the ritual service of the festival of Shavuot. Let's see,
Yeah, but
goes on. So
think about this. Let me throw some monkey wrench into this. You left Egypt. You were wandering the desert for 40 years. Nobody was sowing anything in the desert sands.
That's right.
There wasn't any harvest. So what were folks doing for 40 years
Nah,
if we'd received everything at Mount Sinai and we had all these instructions?
manna. It was instructions for later. Tybal, do you have your hand up?
Yes, maybe you're gonna roll down and show us, but I thought there was another biblical, not rabbinic, but a biblical name for Shavuos, which is Atzeres.
I don't see that
Yeah.
in, I looked in the,
It's
in the
Talmudic.
text.
Talmudic,
Yeah, it's
Oh,
not
Atzeres
biblical.
is one of the rabbinic. Got it.
Talmudic.
Yeah,
It's that Sarah
But good question.
Pesach.
all right. So basically, the Torah gives us a bunch of pieces, but they don't fit together to make a very coherent. They make a picture, but it's kind of blurry and doesn't totally doesn't give us a very sharp idea of what we're supposed to be doing as to when we're celebrating Shavuot. All right, so let's go back to this confusing idea of you bring a sheaf of elevation offering, quote, the day after the Sabbath. So in the Mishnah, they ask a question about how do you perform the harvesting of the barley? And basically, everybody gets all together and there's this formula back and forth. It's a whole ceremony of officials saying, has the sun set? Yes. Okay. Should I reap with a sickle? And everybody says yes. And then should I put them in this basket? Yes. And then they make a point of asking, should I cut on this Shabbat? Now, normally we don't harvest on Shabbat, but the rabbis are trying to make a point here that if the second day of Passover is on Shabbat, then you can harvest on this Shabbat. And they go back and forth about this a couple times, just so everybody's very clear that, yes, you should do this, go ahead. And the Mishnah says, okay, so Nu, why are we making such a tzimus about this? Making a big fuss, and they say it's due to the Bothusians. Now, Bothusians were one of the main families of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the priestly class primarily, and they were in contrast to the Pharisees, who were the rabbis. And the priestly class, the Sadducees, were more allied with the aristocratic and wealthy members of Second Temple Society, and the Pharisees were more allied with the common people of Second Temple Society. And basically, it was about the text where it says, start this the day after the Sabbath, Mimacharat HaShabbat. And the Sadducees say, look, we know what Shabbat is. It's like Shabbat. It's the seventh day of the week. And the Pharisees say, well, based off of this other verse where it says Shabbat, and it really, if you look at it right, it could mean a festival day. We're going to assume that Shabbat here also means a festival day. And this is why we start counting after the second day of Passover, or starting after the first day of Passover, on the second day of Passover. So, and then in the Gemara, they spend 3 more pages giving 3 reasons of why the Sadducees are wrong, why even though it looks like you should be starting on the Sunday of Passover, which would be the day after Shabbat of Passover, really you should be starting on the second day of Passover.
Okay.
So pros and cons of here, if you take the Sadducee position of it says the second day after Shabbat, or it says the day after Shabbat, you count 7 weeks. The advantage is that you've got a very clear, hard to argue with interpretation of the Torah. Torah says the day after Shabbat, you do the day after Shabbat. The disadvantage, Shavuot becomes a floating holiday, sort of akin to US holidays where it's like the second Monday of whatever month. Like it doesn't have a defined date because it's always whenever, it's always like the Sunday or the Monday 7 weeks after the Sunday of Passover. Whereas if you take the Pharisee position, the downside is you have to go through some mental acrobatics to get to the textual justification for it, which is why the Pharisees give 10 reasons because 1 reason isn't good enough. But the advantage is Shavuot has a defined date, which ends up being the 6th of Sivan. So due to this argument, that is how we get, well, let's look at the math. According to the Pharisee interpretation, Passover is in the month of Nisan, it has 30 days. That gets us 15 days. ER has 29 days, that gets us 44 days. Sivan is the next month, so that gets us to the 6th of Sivan. So Shavuot would therefore be on the 6th of Sivan, according to the Pharisee interpretation of the Torah, which is what we go by. All right, so does this make sense how the rabbis interpreted the verse in the Torah in some particular way, and that is how they ended up giving a date to Shavuot, even though the Torah never gave a date to it? Like whether or not you understand,
Qualified, yes.
whether or not you understand all the acrobatics.
Yeah.
Does that process of Torah gives us no date, but it tells us 7 weeks. We do some text, some use for exegesis, some textual interpretation, and we then do some math based off of that interpretation, and that gets us to a date for Shavuot. Does that process make sense?
Yes, although I have a related
Given all
question.
that, yes.
I do have a related, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Phil.
May I just ask about the 16th of Nisan?
Yes.
I'm sure I missed it, but that comes in.
Yeah, so that comes in
where?
because the rabbis say, because the Torah says, start counting your 7 weeks from the day after the Sabbath, Mimacharat HaShabbat. And the rabbis interpret the Sabbath to mean the first day of the festival of Passover.
Oh, so they use the Sabbath there, which is a problematic word in that context, to refer not to the Sabbath that we might find within
Not a day of the
Passover, but to the holiday itself.
Exactly.
Right.
Thank you.
Good
That's
job,
all.
Phil.
The related question I had, I was just wondering, given the dating information we have in the reasoning that's being used here,
Mm-hmm.
is the dating of its observance regarded to be Torah-itic or a rabbinic level command to have it on this specific day?
Well, I don't know for sure. I would guess that the rabbis would say, look, we've anchored it in the Torah, therefore it must be a Torah thing. From a historical perspective, it's something that clearly the rabbis came up with using their interpretation of the Torah, because the Torah doesn't give us a date. The Torah gives us a date for all the other major holidays. It does not give us a date for Shavuot. So it's basically a rabbinic thing, but they might have said, look, we grounded it in the text, therefore you can count it as Torah. But the other thing is that as Jews, we're not biblical Jews. We follow the rabbi's interpretation of the Bible. So you should stick with this date.
Oh, of course. I was just curious if it like for example, if somebody decided not, like, let's say somebody decided to do it on a different day for some reason, would a person be violating a Torah level obligation or a rabbinic level one? That's what I was curious about.
The rabbis would probably say they're violating a biblical interpretation, a Torah level
Okay.
interpretation.
David, it
Yes, sir.
sounds like this may be a point where a line is drawn between the Sadducees' way of doing things and then rabbinic Judaism,
Mhm.
because they were in conflict.
Right.
And so this decision helps to reinforce that we're moving on. We're not going to use what was in the past in terms of certain dates.
Yes, and because so this text comes from the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written after the Mishnah was finalized after the temple was destroyed. After the second temple was destroyed, the Sadducees lost their power. So the Pharisees basically had the control of setting the rules, but because some of the teachings of the Mishnah predated the fall of the Second Temple, therefore, and by this point, people may still have remembered and had like traditions passed on to them. Therefore, they made sure to include this as a reminder, so that in case anybody was confused as to how this happened, they had this recorded. But yes, this was definitely another piece of the Pharisees setting the calendar and getting everybody on board with their approach.
So David,
Yes.
Torah does not give us an exact time for this holiday,
Right.
the anniversary of the giving of the Torah.
Yeah, we're getting there.
We don't know the place where the Torah was given, because we don't know where Mount Sinai is located.
Right.
So if God goes and celebrates the anniversary of giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai every year, and we don't know time he does it or the place he does it, we cannot make the mistake of going there at the right time and coming face to face with God. Maybe that
Sure.
was his reason for not giving it an exact time and location.
Entirely possible. Speaking of that, let's move on because we've got another problem that we have to solve in the next 8 minutes.
May I just say one thing though,
Yes.
that the rabbis did? The one thing, if I recall, that we do know about the giving of the Torah, and yes, Sukkot is my favorite holiday, lifetime, even before my only child was born on Sukkot, but isn't Hakel, which is every 7 years on Sukkot, supposed to be about the giving of the Torah? And that was a Sukkot thing that the rabbis decided to move to Shavuot.
Interesting. Interesting. I will have to look into that further. But let's talk about the giving of the Torah, because on Shavuot, according to the Torah, in Exodus, it says that males appear before God. In Leviticus, you bring an offering of grain. In Numbers, you bring an offering of grain. In Deuteronomy, you bring a free will contribution to God. So this is a pretty temple-centric holiday.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mishnah talks about that like there's no tractate for Shavuot. There is a tractate called Shavuot, which is about oaths, but there's no tractate for Shavuot. But in Bikurim, the first fruits, it talks about the ceremonies for bringing the first fruits to God, because as we remember, one of the names for Shavuot was the holiday of the first fruits. And you give a whole recitation of a passage about how about basically retracing Jewish history, which has made its way into the Passover Haggadah, but it is first quoted in Deuteronomy. So after the temple is destroyed, you got to come up with something to do with Shavuot. Like Sukkot has a biblical explanation of why you should do it. It's because you should remember that you lived in Sukkot in these huts while you were traveling through the desert. Passover has a biblical explanation about leaving Egypt, but Shavuot has nothing. So it gets to be reinvented. So in the Talmud, in Sachim, which is about Passover, it talks about, first of all, Rabbi Elazar gives a new name to Shavuot. He calls it Atzeret. And he says that it's important to eat, drink, and rejoice on the day, which the Torah did say you should rejoice on this holiday. It was in Deuteronomy. So he says, why? Well, it's the day that the Torah was given, and you should celebrate that. And a little bit later, another rabbi gives the same explanation. Later commentators connect Atzeret to Shmini Atzeret as a conclusion and say that Shavuot is a conclusion to the Passover period. It's connected with 49 days instead. So then that's a question of, okay, well, that's a lovely claim, but like, how are you connecting Shavuot with the giving of the Torah? So for that, we need to do some biblical math. In the story of the giving of the Torah, which is the Torah reading on the first day of Shavuot, it says on the third new moon, third month, which would be Sivan, because we have Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, so in the beginning of the month of Sivan, Sivan day 1, they get to Sinai. And then God talks to Moses and says a bunch of stuff to him. And then God tells Moses, go to the people, tell them to stay pure today and tomorrow, let them wash their clothes, let them be ready for the third day, for on the third day, God will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai, which appears to imply that the Torah was given on the third day of Sivan. So that would put that at Sivan 3, and now Passover or Shavuot is on Sivan 6. But those are pretty close. So the rabbis go through a whole explanation about why really it's the 6th of Sivan when the Torah was given and not the 3rd of Sivan. And again, and it stands on some rabbinic logic that I personally find not terribly convincing. You can read through it for yourself and see if you find it more convincing. You can look at my explanation of it and then go into Safaria if you really want to dig in the weeds. But they basically make it do some logic and then some stretching of the math. And then they say, okay, fine. So it's close enough. So like, this is how we get to it. So, and then we've got in the appendix other texts. So to recap, the Torah tells us that Shavuot is 7 weeks after Passover, after the Shabbat of Passover. The rabbis do some textual interpretation and say, well, really that means after this first day of Passover, so Shavuot is on the 6th of Sivan. The Torah also tells us that Shavuot is all about bringing sacrifices to the temple and not working. But after the temple is destroyed, the rabbis have to come up with something else to do with Shavuot because they can't ignore it. It's in the Torah pretty often. And so they notice that the date of when the Torah was with the 10 Commandments or the Torah, whatever, happened at Mount Sinai is on the surface, the 3rd of Sivan. And already they've anchored Shavuot on the 6th of Sivan. And so they do a little bit more textual interpretation and they bring them together. And that is how we got the date of Sivan, and we attach it to the date of Shavuot, and we attach it to the giving of the 10 Commandments.
But David,
Yes.
Moses went up the mountain to get the Torah. He was there for 40 days and 40 nights.
He was.
How do you know which of those 40 days or 40 nights he was given any part of the Torah? Could have been spread over those all 40 days and not just one day.
Right. So first it says that he was up. First it says that the 10 Commandments were given, and then it says he's up there for another 40 days after that. And that's when the rest of the rules, certainly up until the giving of the golden calf, possibly beyond that, were given as well.
So they've smuggled in the whole Torah under the 10 Commandments and the subsequent days. Is that right? Because we don't have any reference to the Torah in the Torah as such. Clearly.
Right. So
Right.
so what was given in the rest of the time is up for interpretation.
And do we celebrate the giving of the Torah the first time before the golden calf, or the second time after the golden calf?
The first. There is rabbinic math that suggests that the tablets were broken on the 17th of Tammuz,
Right.
and that the tablets were brought down on Yom Kippur as a day of second chances. But that is a class for another time.